Welcome back, everyone. We're diving deep today into the recent upheaval in the Middle East and specifically the collapse of Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria.
Yeah, it's a major shift in the region, for sure.
And we're going to connect this to uh, the regional war that was triggered by Hamas's attack on Israel.
It's fascinating how that event really set off a chain reaction that led to some pretty unexpected outcomes.
Yeah, definitely a lot to unpack here. So why don't we start with that Hamas attack on Israel back in 2023? Tragic loss of life, 1,200 Israelis killed.
A devastating event, and it seems like Hamas miscalculated the response, both from Israel and from the wider region.
It seems like they were aiming at exploiting those internal divisions within Israel, but it backfired spectacularly.
Right, and while the attack itself was horrific, the aftermath actually led to the weakening of Iran's so-called axis of resistance.
Axis of resistance. Now, that's something we should probably explain quickly for our listeners.
Yeah, that's Iran's network of groups like Hezbollah that they essentially use to project their power throughout the region.
Okay, so the attack weakens this axis of resistance. And then you said something else about the rise of a group called HTS.
Right. Hayat Tahrir Al-Sham, or HTS for short, that's the rebel group that ultimately ended up toppling Assad in Syria.
HTS. I have a feeling we're going to be hearing that name a lot more in the future. But before we get into their role, let's go back to that initial Hamas attack for a moment. You mentioned it expanded into a wider conflict, pulling in Hezbollah and Iran. So what exactly happened there?
Well, Hezbollah, the Lebanese Shia militia, they initially looked pretty strong. They had, get this, over 100,000 missiles and rockets, a huge arsenal.
Wow, that's a serious threat.
Their leader, Hassan Nasrallah, he gambled on supporting Hamas, believing they could win a decisive victory against Israel.
Bold move. Considering Israel's military capabilities, I'm guessing their response was pretty forceful.
Oh, absolutely. Israel launched a counteroffensive that was swift and devastating. Targeted Hezbollah's infrastructure, their leadership really hit them hard.
So airstrikes, I assume.
Yeah, inflicted heavy losses on Hezbollah fighters.
Yeah.
Their capabilities were significantly degraded.
Wow. And on top of that, Hezbollah was also launching those rockets into Israel, right?
Right, yeah, and that ultimately forced them into a ceasefire.
Had to pull back, regroup.
Exactly. And they ended up withdrawing forces from Syria.
And that's where HTS comes into the picture.
You got it.
Yeah.
Hezbollah, weakened and now focused on their own conflict with Israel, they left a void in Syria.
And it seems like HTS was just waiting in the wings for this opportunity.
They were been strategically planning an offensive for months, getting support from Turkey.
Smart move, laying low and waiting for the right moment.
They knew Hezbollah's retreat was their chance, a power vacuum they were ready to exploit.
Wow, talk about seizing the moment. But what about Iran during all of this? They were directly involved, weren't they?
Oh yeah, they were a key player, saw the conflict as a chance to strike at Israel directly.
I mean, their axis of resistance was being challenged, right?
Right, but their decision to launch missiles into Israel, well, that turned out to be a big miscalculation.
Israel retaliated.
Big-time targeted airstrikes heavily damaged Iran's military infrastructure, further weakened their influence in the region.
So you have a weakened Hezbollah, forced to retreat from Syria, and a vulnerable Iran facing setbacks. And this is where we see those dominoes start to fall, ultimately leading to the collapse of Assad's regime.
Exactly. Hezbollah couldn't give Assad the support he needed to stay in power. And with HTS ready to pounce, the stage was set for a dramatic power shift in Syria.
It's amazing how one event can set off such a chain reaction, like you were saying. We've got a new power in charge in Syria, one with a very different history with Israel than Assad. Definitely going to be different. It's uncertain, to say the least. Uncertain's a good word. I mean, we've got HTS leader, Mohammed al-Julani, making statements that sound like they want to focus on governing Syria.
Right, not on engaging in some kind of global jihad, like they've kind of distanced themselves from groups like al-Qaeda or ISIS.
But then their actions haven't exactly been reassuring, have they? I mean, they praised those initial attacks from Hamas on Israel, but since they took control of Syria, silence.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to play both sides, which, you know, in that region, it's a pretty risky game.
Definitely a lot of mixed signals. And then you have that faction within HTS, the group based in Damascus. They came right out and said they intend to attack Israel. How seriously should we be taking this threat?
Well, it's hard to say, to be honest. It's definitely a cause for concern, but it's tough to know how much support they actually have within the larger HTS movement.
It's not like they're a monolithic group, right? There's got to be internal divisions, different factions with different goals.
Exactly. And, I mean, with Hezbollah having just gotten their butts kicked, I doubt too many other groups are eager to jump into a fight with Israel right now.
Not the best timing, for sure. But that doesn't mean we can just rule out the possibility of smaller attacks or provocations, does it?
No, definitely not. Things could escalate quickly. And meanwhile, Israel isn't just sitting back and waiting to see what happens. They've taken some pretty decisive actions in response to Assad's fall.
Yeah, you're talking about those airstrikes targeting Syrian military assets, right?
Mm,
And even seizing territory in the Golan Heights.
exactly. They're calling these preemptive actions aimed at preventing Syria's military capabilities from falling into the wrong hands.
The wrong hands being pretty much anyone who's not on Israel's side, right?
Yeah, pretty much. They're worried about these weapons ending up with terrorist groups, or maybe even with HTS factions that are hostile to Israel.
So they're hitting airfields, missile sites, naval bases, anything they think could pose a threat in the future.
Right, and they've even gone after what's left of Syria's chemical weapons program, which, is understandable given the potential consequences.
Absolutely nobody wants to see those weapons used. But
Mm.
even if Israel claims these are purely defensive moves, it's hard not to see them as potentially provocative, right?
Yeah, you're not wrong. I mean, they're basically saying, we're not going to wait around and see what you do. We're going to take action now to ensure our security, which, from their perspective, it makes sense.
They've got a history of being surrounded by hostile forces, so I
Yeah.
can understand that mindset. But it's also pretty risky, isn't it? Like poking a hornet's nest?
Yeah, there's definitely a risk that these actions could backfire and actually escalate tensions in the region. They could push those very forces they're trying to deter into a direct confrontation.
It's a delicate balancing act for sure. And we can't forget about the international response. Either the UN, several Arab states, they've all condemned Israel's seizure of Syrian territory in the Golan Heights.
Yeah, it's not going over well internationally. Even if Israel insists it's temporary for defensive purposes, it's still creating a lot of friction.
It's a reminder that this isn't just a regional issue. It's got global implications.
Yeah.
And it's playing out against the backdrop of all this tension and uncertainty. But maybe, just maybe, there's a glimmer of hope here too.
I hope. Well, I'm all ears.
Well, with Assad gone, there's at least the possibility, however slim, of a more democratic Syria emerging. One that could potentially even pursue peaceful relations with its neighbors, even Israel.
Now, that would be a game changer. But let's be realistic here. Given the history between Syria and Israel, how likely is that scenario? What would have to happen for us to even start to imagine such a dramatic shift?
Yeah, it's a long shot for sure. But hey, sometimes history surprises us. If the new leadership in Syria actually prioritizes stability and diplomacy over conflict, and if Israel is willing to reciprocate, then maybe, just maybe, we could see some thawing of relations.
It's a big if, but I guess anything's possible, right?